Welcome to Lecture 30. We're in the middle of grappling with the new science of heat, thermodynamics as it came to be known. It evolved in the decades around the middle of the 19th century. Today we're going to see that even a subject like thermodynamics sounds kind of technical. Even a subject like this can spill over into issues that affect the outlook of the average person. In fact, it can even be part of what we in the 21st century know as culture wars. By that I mean public arguments over what is culturally correct and what is culturally incorrect. Last time, we began to get a feel for why heat was so central a subject. In a nutshell, it was because people like Robert Meyer, James Joule, Hermann Helmholtz all had begun to question the assumption of many, including their predecessor, Sadi Carnot, that heat was merely made use of when motive force was produced. Recall that Carnot had set down as an axiom that if heat were used to move matter, to produce what he called motive force, then it was necessary for heat at a higher temperature to fall to a lower temperature. Without this temperature difference, the heat, he said, was useless. We also need to recall how Carnot thought of the situation. He imagined that the way the heat was used to produce motive force when it fell from a higher to a lower temperature was something like the fall of water from a higher to a lower position in a water wheel. It was the fall that correlated with the motive force produced. And because he thought of it in these terms, Carnot concluded that at the end of the process you had the same amount of heat as you'd had at the beginning. That's the way it is in the case of the water wheel. You use the water to turn the wheel, but you don't lose the water. The water itself is not used up. If we could get the water back to where it was at the top of the water wheel, we could use it again. So when we produce a motive force using a water wheel, we say that the water itself is conserved. There's the same amount of water before the process of turning the wheel begins as there is after it concludes. Now, Carnot thought that heat was conserved when it produced motive force for a similar reason. You took the heat from a hot body, delivered it to a cold body, just as you took the water at a higher position and delivered it to a lower position. In both cases, the motive force emerged as the result of the fall from higher to lower temperature with heat engines, from higher to lower positions with the water wheel. The idea that heat was conserved when you used it to produce motion in matter was what Meyer, Joule, and Helmholtz began to question in their work. And these three individuals struggled with the issue of how heat was used to produce mechanical motion. They all came to the conclusion that Carnot had made a mistake in assuming that heat was conserved when steam engines produced motive force. As Meyer reflected on the source of the force used by the body to move its parts, he'd concluded it was supplied by the heat that came from the oxidation of food. And that heat, he believed, was lost as heat because it actually became mechanical motion. It had changed from one form of force into another. It wasn't like the water wheel situation. At least some of the heat you began with wasn't around anymore at the end. Joule was the real experimentalist of the three. He conducted a lot of experiments, some involving falling weights, others involving electrical currents, to see if he could determine the precise quantitative mechanical equivalent of other forms of force. As we saw last time, he was convinced from his experiments that he could show precisely how much heat was equivalent to how much mechanical force. And finally, Helmholtz generalized the conclusion that heat became mechanical motion by suggesting that all forms of what he called tensive force could become living force. Other tensive forces besides heat, for example, electrical, magnetic, chemical forces, could also be transformed into motive forces. Of course, mechanical or living forces could be used to produce tensive forces as well. If you mechanically raise an object up to a height where it is then supported, you'd converted mechanical force into tensive force. That's the tensive force of gravitational attraction. And the generator, as we saw in an earlier lecture, used mechanical force to produce electrical force. So here the mechanical force disappeared as electrical force appeared. All these interconversions between tensive forces and motive force meant that force was never lost or created, just changed from one kind to another. So, by the time the 1840s were nearing an end, scientists had begun to come to the conclusion that Carnot had been wrong about heat being conserved in heat engines. Heat had become mechanical force. But there was an interesting twist ahead as physicists continued to explore the interconvertibility of forces. And today, we want to explore how scientists came to the conclusion that these interconversions back and forth could not just go on forever. Now, clearly, if this conclusion was correct, it had implications for how the history of the world was to be understood. Not that most people thought the world would go on forever. There was a widespread belief that the physical world we live in would someday end. That idea was built into several of the religious traditions that flourished in 19th century Europe and America. It was certainly part of the Christian tradition, which was agreed on the matter in both its Protestant and Catholic forms. And that spoke for a lot of people in the West. But it was the way the physical world would end that was new in the scientific vision. And that way presented a challenge to those who were devoted to the traditional view they had learned in Sunday school. Not only so, but I'm willing to argue that the eventual vision of the future that emerged from thermodynamics was a real contributor to a tragic view of humankind's destiny. And the tragic view I'm referring to flourished more in the 20th century. This tragic sense of a world in which all physical activity would slowly cease, a destiny that humankind could not escape. That was, in my opinion, part of what led to a kind of fundamental questioning of modernity that's still with us. It was the sense that there's no higher meaning in nature, no noble destiny into which humankind's presence had any significance. Now, that's a big subject, and we don't, of course, get into it into the 20th century in this course. But what I'm saying is that all this talk about heat and its properties may sound kind of irrelevant, of interest only to physicists. But it's part of a much larger story, and we do well to understand as much of that story as we can. So today, I want to tell you a bit about how it got started. We saw last time how special heat was among all of nature's forces. That's reinforced again here. We're going to see that of all nature's forces, heat was the one on which the new realization about the future of nature turned. Okay, now, for those in the 1840s who were trying to learn what they could about heat, it appeared that they had to make a choice between Carnot and Joule. I could have picked Mayer or Helmholtz as the opponent of Carnot, but I've picked Joule because he was the one who had precisely measured the mechanical equivalent of heat, the amount of mechanical force a given quantity of heat turned into. The question appeared to revolve solely around one issue, whether heat was conserved when it was used to produce motive force or not. Either Carnot had been right that heat was conserved, that you merely made use of heat in steam engines. That is, the heat was not used up, it wasn't converted into mechanical force. Or Joule was right, that heat was used up. It became mechanical motion. It disappeared as mechanical motion appeared. Here, heat was converted into mechanical force. This seemed to be the choice, these choices seemed to be the choices in the 1840s. But then, as so often happens, along came a compromise position. In 1850, a young physicist named Rudolf Clausius in Germany challenged this either-or way of framing the issue. Clausius suggested that it wasn't simply a matter of what Carnot or Joule believed about the conservation of heat. There was more involved. In fact, he said, there were important aspects of both Carnot's work and of Joule's work that should be retained. Clausius argued that Carnot had been right to correlate the fall in temperature with the mechanical force produced. They were definitely proportional to each other. But Clausius also thought Joule was correct, that heat was converted into mechanical motion. So how did he put these two claims together? Well, Clausius's solution was to suggest that when heat was used to obtain mechanical motion, only some of the heat was turned into mechanical motion, while some was merely transferred from a warm body to a colder one. He was careful to point out that the question of how much heat became mechanical motion and how much was merely transferred to the colder body were strictly determined amounts. Both of these portions of the heat, that which became the mechanical motion and that which was transferred from the hot body to the cold body, stood in a precise proportional relationship to the mechanical motion produced. So, to repeat, the implications of this were that when heat was used to obtain mechanical motion, not all of the heat was converted to motion, since some, of necessity, cooled to a lower temperature. Okay, so we have to keep insights from both Carnot and Joule. So what? What's the big deal about that? Well, Clausius's conclusions were re-expressed the following year by the Scotsman William Thomson. I mentioned him at the end of the last lecture. He was the one who had had the questions for Joule at the British Association meeting of 1847, and he had come to the same conclusion Clausius had spelled out so carefully. Now, even though he came to the same conclusion as Clausius, Thomson acknowledged that Clausius had been the first one to make these conclusions public. But it was Thomson who introduced a new way of talking about the situation. He introduced the word energy into the discussion. That word had been used a half-century earlier by Thomson's countryman, Thomas Young, to refer to what Leibniz had long before called vis viva, living force. So it wasn't an unprecedented coining of a new term. But Thomson used the word energy instead of force to focus on the effect the motion of matter had, as opposed to the mere push of the steam on the piston. So we've come back to that distinction Leibniz had introduced so many years earlier with his vis viva, or living force. I suggested back when we discussed that issue in lecture 25 that Leibniz's category of living force focused attention on the effect the force had rather than on the push or pull it exerted. Of course, the two are related, but there's a subtle difference. Those who sided with Leibniz in the old vis viva controversy, like the Dutchman I told you about who dropped balls onto clay, they were trying to measure the effect the moving matter produced, the size of the dent in the clay. They were interested in more than just how hard the moving matter pushed. And this is what Thomson was trying to get at by choosing the word energy. Sometimes physicists use the phrase mechanical work. That too was different from the mere push or pull as well. They wanted to know what had been achieved by the application of the force, what effect had been produced. The idea of doing work involved not only the strength of the push that moving matter exerted, but how much distance the force had been exerted through. And that was revealed more by what kind of an effect had been produced, how big the dent in the clay was. So energy became a synonym for this idea of effect or work. How much energy was present was a measure of how much work could be done, how much of an effect could be produced. So, as Thomson thought about the mechanical motion that could be produced from heat, he expressed it in terms of energy to draw attention to the effect or work you could get from heat. But then Thomson went further. He turned his attention to the part of the heat that was not converted into mechanical energy. Like Clausius, Thomson had come to the realization that some of the heat was not going to be converted into mechanical energy. Some of the heat would merely drop from a higher temperature to a lower one. In Thomson's case, he'd realized this by thinking about a real heat engine. Carnot, recall, had imagined an ideal engine. But in a real heat engine, some of the heat was conducted through the walls of the boiler. Here there was a transfer of heat from one place to another, but no mechanical force appeared. So Thomson concluded that when heat is used to produce mechanical energy, only some of it becomes mechanical energy, and some is moved from a higher to a temperature to a lower one. Now, like everybody else, Thomson didn't believe that force, what he's now calling energy, could be destroyed. So he said that if you took the amount of heat at the beginning, then the sum of what was converted into mechanical energy plus that which was not had to equal what you started with. Okay, so far so good. But here's where Thomson saw farther down the road than others. Here's where he saw something that would be the foundation for the tragic drama of the universe I mentioned when we began today. And he's not alone in realizing this, but Thomson is a good point of reference. Thomson thought more about the part of the original heat that was not converted into mechanical energy. It impressed him that part of the heat energy could not be converted into mechanical energy. It was an unavoidable part of the process. It had to be there, but it was not available for conversion into the mechanical motion of matter. So Thomson concluded that whenever heat energy was converted into mechanical energy, some of the heat became unavailable to provide motive force. It was, in Thomson's word, dissipated. What Thomson was saying was that every time heat is used to do mechanical work, some of the heat invariably becomes unavailable. It's taken out of commission, so to speak. And that meant the process was irreversible. There was a part of the original heat energy, the part that had become unavailable, that would never again be available for conversion back into mechanical energy. Now let me return for just a second to Helmholtz's famous paper of 1847. We talked about that last time. Recall that Helmholtz had described heat as a tensive force. It could produce matter in motion. It could become mechanical or living force if the right conditions prevailed. But it wasn't yet mechanical force. Thomson's way of describing this situation would be to say that heat was potentially able to become what he called actual energy, by which he meant what I've been calling mechanical energy. He wouldn't start using kinetic energy, which is our term today, until 1867. So again, when heat is used to produce actual energy, not all of it can be converted to actual energy. Now, let's look at heat before it's converted to actual energy. Before heat is converted into actual energy, it represents energy that could potentially become actual energy. It was Thomson's colleague William Rankine who coined the term potential energy. So now, here in the 1850s, Helmholtz's claim that the sum of all tensive and living forces at the same time was a constant, at any time was a constant, became the declaration that the sum of potential and actual energy was a constant. Rankine stated in 1853 what he called the law of the conservation of energy. Here's how he put it: the sum of the actual and potential energies in the universe is unchangeable. This result, which we express by saying that the sum of the kinetic plus the potential energy in the universe is a constant, is known today as the first law of thermodynamics. Another way of expressing it is to say that energy can neither be created nor destroyed, although it can be transformed from one kind into another. I have to confess to you that I've made this 19th century story a little cleaner than it actually was at the time. The word energy, referring to the capacity to do work, only slowly replaced force in these treatments of thermodynamics. That was because physicists were slowly coming to clarity about the best way to think about all this. In 1854, a year after Rankine had explicitly referred to the law of the conservation of energy, Hermann Helmholtz, we met him before, he made the cosmic implications of Thomson's dissipated or unavailable energy clear. And that result, the one involving the inevitable transformation of energy in the universe into a form that was unavailable to do work, eventually became known as the second law of thermodynamics. This was the law that bore the ominous sense of tragedy for humankind, and Helmholtz was among the first to let the world know the bad news. It was in one of his famous popular lectures, this one delivered at his university in Königsberg, entitled The Interaction of Natural Forces. See, he still used the word force. This lecture was when Helmholtz explained the results we've been reviewing here. And he then went on to draw inferences of cosmic and tragic proportions. He began by observing that mechanical force could be converted into heat, and heat could be converted into mechanical force. That much everybody in his audience understood from common sense. They knew that when a moving body collided with another, heat was produced, and they certainly knew that steam could be used to produce mechanical motion in machinery. But then Helmholtz tried to include some of the refinements that people like Clausius and Thomson had added to this common sense knowledge. Helmholtz pointed out what Thomson had shown about dissipated energy. When heat was used to produce mechanical work, he explained, not all of the heat needed for the process to occur became mechanical work. Some of it simply cooled from a higher to a lower temperature. So Helmholtz divided the store of what he still called force in the world into two parts. All the forces that could be converted into each other, and the force that could not because it was in the form of dissipated heat, which Thomson had shown was no longer available to do mechanical work. And here came the kicker. Helmholtz made clear that because, as Thomson said, every time heat was used to produce mechanical work, there was some that was dissipated, taken out of commission, no longer available to do work, then the amount of dissipated energy in the cosmos must be constantly increasing. If the audience began to sense there was bad news ahead, Helmholtz didn't make them wait long for the cruel truth. He noted that it was the interconversion of forces that constituted all the changes that occur in nature. Without them, nothing would happen. There would be no existence, since nothing would ever change. But with every conversion, there was always a byproduct of some heat. And if you gathered up that heat and converted it back into mechanical force, that mechanical force that moved matter around, a portion of that heat was always going to become Thomson's dissipated heat. His conclusion? The store of dissipated heat will grow until eventually all force has been converted into it. At this point, he announced the bald truth to those gathered there in Königsberg, and these are his words. Then all possibility of a further change will be at an end, and the complete cessation of all natural processes must set in. The universe, he said, was ultimately threatened with eternal death. Now, the tragic meaning of the second law of thermodynamics made its way only slowly into general knowledge. It was assisted by paintings like that of Camille Flammarion as the century came to an end. His vivid depiction in separate panels of an icy landscape in which humans would freeze to death was entitled The End of the World. Flammarion himself was not directly attempting to depict the second law of thermodynamics. He believed, in fact, the end of the world would be due to a lack of water vapor in the atmosphere. Nevertheless, his paintings began to be associated with the tragic end of the world demanded by the second law. One panel bore the label, the wretched human race will freeze to death. And the other, this will be the end. The subtext that gave it all so tragic a meaning was that human existence was, after all was said and done, pointless. And that was apparently the message of natural science. What science was saying was that there's no higher meaning in nature itself. But that seemed to cut God completely off from nature in a manner that was totally unacceptable to most people. And yet, there would be a growing number of folks in the 20th century who would embrace this message, and with that embrace, reject the optimism that had always been the unwritten assumption of modernity. So as you can imagine, the lessons about the physical world that were coming out of the new science of thermodynamics were not something people were used to. And where they filtered down to popular culture, as eventually they would, they had an impact on traditional religious assumptions. In fact, the notion of a heat death wasn't all that easy for some scientists to accept. For one thing, it clashed with the old Laplacian cosmos we met back in Lecture 2. Remember that Laplace's natural science had regarded the cosmos created perfect by God to be a perpetual motion machine with no apparent role for human free will. The machinery of the heavens ground on eternally because all the apparent instabilities really corrected themselves over time. But the message of thermodynamics was that the cosmos was not an eternally stable machinery. It was wearing down. There was an irreversibility built into the very physical processes that undergirded reality. If anything, the new science of thermodynamics seemed to vindicate a general religious sense that there would be an end of time. Laplace had spoken too quickly. But the new view, based on the dissipation of energy, also carried implications for those who held more traditional religious positions. And one such individual was William Thomson himself. Thomson had been raised in the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. He was incredibly gifted in physics, as we've already seen, and he also took his religious upbringing very seriously. As a young man of 19, he watched things unfold when that significant event called the Great Disruption occurred in Scotland. We encountered that back in Lecture 19 when we discussed the context in which Chambers' sensational book had appeared. It happened in 1843, and it involved disgruntled members of the Church of Scotland who split off to form the Free Church. They were unhappy with what they saw as compromises that the national church was making with the modern age, and they determined they were going to remain closer to the Bible in their beliefs and worship. Perhaps Thomson, the young student, merely wondered what it all meant back then in 1843, but in the ensuing decades he found himself torn as he confronted the issue of how to harmonize his love of natural science with his devotion to his personal religion. He himself could not identify with liberal deistic naturalism. He was no Laplacian. His religious sense was much more personal than that. But then he really didn't identify with the biblical literalists of the Free Church either. So Thomson crafted his own unique religious position, and he did so in conjunction with his new understanding of energy. And there he drew on the irreversibility of all physical processes that he, as much as anyone, had helped to uncover. Irreversibility suggested an end to the world, and that both opposed Laplacian naturalism and was consistent with his Presbyterian faith. Let me remind you that we met Thomson back in Lecture 22 in a biological context, when we were considering problems with Darwin's theory. He was the one who, based on thermodynamical arguments, had said there just wasn't enough time for evolution by natural selection to have occurred. Actually, Thomson's real enemy in that story was Charles Lyell, because it had been Lyell's conclusions about geological processes that had given Darwin all the time he needed. And Lyell had been motivated, you'll recall, by his strict opposition to the idea of progressive development. So Lyell had said that the Earth had never developed from a primitive condition to the one we observe today. It had always existed in a steady state. Well, of course, if Lyell was right about that, if the Earth had always been in a steady state, then it wasn't wearing down. So if Lyell was right, then the conclusion about the heat death of the universe had to be wrong. And Thomson resented and opposed writers like Lyell, who didn't understand physics and still insisted that the Earth's past was a steady state with no change at all. Thomson declared that everything in nature is progressive, by which he meant that nature was progressing toward an end irreversibly. He seemed to delight in being able to contradict the evolutionists by opposing them with the results of physics. It was as if he were challenging them to explain how what they were saying had merit when it so clearly was inconsistent with the laws of the physical world. On the other hand, as I've indicated, Thomson was no religious reactionary either. He didn't think that the end times physics predicted were anything like close at hand, as more traditional Presbyterians did. Like other North British scientists who held views similar to his, Thomson could claim that the latest science supported a religious view that opposed scientific naturalism without endorsing old-fashioned biblical literalism. Consistent with his inherited Presbyterian understanding of the economy of nature, in which nothing should be wasted, Thomson said humans were enjoined to be stewards of the Creator's gift of energy so as to minimize the inevitable waste. He was happy to note that humans didn't have the option of restoring unavailable energy so it could be used to do work, since that was the prerogative of the Creator alone. But in the decades just after mid-century, it was the conservation of energy that made the greater impact. And that was made use of in a particular way during a controversy over materialism that was raging at the time. And that will be the subject of our next lecture.